Well, what I've been doing is, for the last 5 years or so, most recently, is I've gone back and refocused most of my research on fertility in Israel. I have a few different publications that have stemmed from that research. Some of it is ongoing. I just put this up here. I'm not going to be able to talk about all those things, but I will highlight a few things that I think are interesting. I would like to start with some descriptive trends and explain a little bit what they mean, and then get into a little bit more analytical. So please feel free to stop and ask questions of things that are interest to you. More than happy to do that. I'm not going to talk about the data or the methodology or anything like that, but anyone who wants to ask about that later, certainly welcome. So I'm going to skip through all this. Okay, well, let me just quickly touch on, so can you see that? Is that okay? This Oh, okay. I took this from some research done by Ahmed at the Central Bureau of Statistics. And this is just showing actually some kind of an interesting data about the Muslim population in Israel. And this is just giving some information about fertility in different periods, in different time periods. It's sort of an aggregate measure of fertility in different times. And what happened was, for a really long time, following a decline in fertility that started in the mid-60s, there was a decline from around 9 or 10 to around 5 or 4.5, and then we entered into this period of stagnation for about a decade and a half, and people were wondering what's going on with that period stagnation. So I'll say a little bit about that later. But what's interesting and noteworthy is that since about 15 years ago, we've seen a continuing decline in Muslim fertility. This ends here at 2009, but if we continue the graph out to 2014, we see it's going to continue to decline to around 3.3 over here. And it's also interesting to note that Ahmed was able to break up these data by level of religiosity. So the decline is at all different levels of religiosity. Not only the very religious, but the less religious, and everybody. So it's an across-the-board decline. That's not something that I think everybody is very aware of, that there have been dramatic declines in fertility among Muslims, and actually there's a pretty close to convergence between Muslim fertility and Jewish fertility.
How do you define TFR? How do you measure it?
How is it measured? It's what's done is you measure fertility rates by age in a given period. So for example, number of babies born to women aged 20 to 24 in the year 2000 divided by the number of women aged 20 to 24 in the year 2000. That's an age-specific fertility rate. And then you accumulate, you add up all the age-specific fertility rates in a given year, multiply it by 5, so it's a synthetic cohort measure. In other words, it's sort of saying if a woman lived her whole reproductive life according to the age-specific rates that are existing in 1 year, that would be the average number of children that she would have. Okay, so it doesn't reflect the actual experience of real women. It's a synthetic measure that summarizes the level of fertility in a given period. There's always a problem when you measure fertility, because the basic methodological problem of fertility is that it happens over a long time. Women can have children from age 15 to 49. So how do you summarize in one period actually a process which occurs over decades in the lifetime of individual women? It's a methodological problem. But so this period measure tries to create a hypothetical measure on that. But anyway, when we look at actual cohorts, we'll see not these synthetic cohorts, we'll actually see a different pattern. But the main point that I want to see is that after a long period of stagnation, we're in a big decline here, and a period fertility is declining among Muslims, and it's quite close to Jews. This is the graph also from Ahmed for Jews. Oh, sorry, it's in Hebrew. So you see it's very, very wide levels, but roughly speaking, the levels among the different Jewish populations by religiosity have been roughly constant. There haven't been such a huge change. So Muslims have declined and Jews have more or less stayed constant, and there's been a convergence. Okay, so now I want to look at cohorts. Cohorts are actual groups of women. Okay, if we can talk about, let's say, women who were born in the 1960s who have already finished their childbearing. They've already reached the older ages. And how many kids have they had? Well, in a lot of other countries that we like to compare ourselves to, like Europe or the US, high values would be just around 2. In France or in the US, in low values would be around 1.5. How does Israel compare to that for actual groups of women? And we'll see it's very high. So even though here, now I'm graphing some cohorts, some actual number of average children per group of women, and here are the Muslims and the Arabs. They're going way, way down. They're down here in the last cohort, so you have to wait a long time till women get older to see how many kids they eventually have. But the more recent cohorts are down to around 3.5. And here for Jews, it's constant at around 3. So you can see here very clearly that convergence. Okay. And as I said before, for the Muslims, it's happening across the board for more religious and less religious. Okay, for Jews, here you see this huge diversity here, that for Jews, ultra-Orthodox, we were hitting at around 8, and now it's after some decline down to 7.0, so it's really high. But there are other groups that are also quite high. Women who are religious but not ultra-Orthodox are also around 4, which is very, very high for developed country societies. And here are secular Jews, which even they are quite high. They're the lowest group, but they're still high. Over 2 is high compared to developed country populations.
Would you like pointer?
Oh, thanks. Okay.
Upper, the upper button.
Oh, thank you. Okay. Please feel free to stop me along the way if you want to.
I have actually a question.
Sure.
What we always are talking about in our group, on population, is that in the 50s, the population, the fertility rate for Haredi women was 2.5, mid-50s or something like that. So is it because that, and I see your numbers are much higher, is it because the cohort issue or of taking the different time periods? And I'm just wondering what.
Well, I think beyond that, there really was a big increase in ultra-Orthodox fertility. I mean, even if you measure a period or cohort, it's gonna look similar. I mean, in the case of Muslims, it's different if you look at a period or cohort, but for ultra-Orthodox, roughly speaking, you're going to see that huge increase.
No, but I see even in the 50s, the beginning of your chart, that the number was pretty high. It was much higher than 2.5.
If I may, the birth cohort was much earlier.
Yeah, I'm sorry, let me explain what this means. Birth cohort of 1948 to 1952 means women who were born then, so they would be having their kids like in the 70s or 80s. So that's going to be like 20 or 30 years after when you're talking about it. Yes.
But their mothers were indeed at that 2.5?
Yeah, their mothers were lower. I don't know, where did you get that 2.5 number? I'm not so familiar.
Alon's book.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Probably sharper in the economics department.
Oh, okay, yeah, right, yeah.
I want to ask about some very important data.
Yeah.
The research that you are doing is in the territory of the Green Line or all the territory of include the West Bank? and Gaza, because
who,
now
Jews?
it's one area.
The Jews? You're
No,
talking about?
you're talking about Muslim also.
No, in this data I have for Muslims, it's not including over the green line. It's not including East Jerusalem, and it's only speaking of Muslims inside the green line.
But they are the same consumer.
The same consumer?
Consumer that use the sources.
Oh, okay, well, okay, here this is sort of, my research wasn't really focused on issues of population growth. I mean,
yeah.
That's why Alon invited me here, but originally I was looking at within Israel in terms of the context of Israel, the society of Israel, the factors in Israel which are associated with fertility policy and social structure and so on. So it's going to be, I mean, we know, for example, even when you compare East Jerusalem Muslims to Muslims.
There is some lack in the research, I think.
Well, you can call it a lack, but I mean, that wasn't my focus.
Okay.
Okay, it's
okay,
not,
no.
I could have included, for example, East Jerusalem, but I specifically took that out because the patterns of fertility and education and labor force participation of women in East Jerusalem are very different than in other Muslims in Israel.
All of us, we are using the same environment.
Yeah.
The same water sources.
Yeah, okay, well, it's a different research question. I mean, my research question are what are social factors that are associated with fertility? Your research question is how does fertility and population change impact environment? So it's a little bit different research question, but I see where you're coming from. Okay. Yes, and it is true that in East Jerusalem the fertility is going to be a little bit higher. A little bit higher. It's not dramatically different than what you see inside Israel. Okay, well, so yeah, just to summarize what I was saying, that we have seen dramatic change, cohort decline in fertility among Muslims. There's a lot of heterogeneity across Jews, but hasn't been that much change. And something I'd like to talk about later, there are two things I'd like to talk about later. One is, how do we understand the very high fertility of ultra-Orthodox and religious women? And the other is, why is it that even secular Jews in Israel have high fertility, which is at or above replacement level, which is high compared to developed country populations? So I'll get back into that later. Okay, so demographers like to talk about parity distribution. Parity is how many children have you ever had, total. And one of the things that's very striking all across Europe and the United States is that there is an entrenched two-child norm. If you look at most completed families, the most common family size is 2. Now in certain parts of Europe it's 1 child, or childlessness is increasing, but still 2 is the most common family size. In Israel that's not the case, where the most common family size is 3. Also, you do have 1-child families and childlessness, and relatively low proportions of children in Europe, proportions of family in Europe with 3 or more children. Israel is really different than that pattern. And so just to break it down by how many children all women are having, we have here the blue is childless, women who have no children at the end of the childbearing years. 1 child, 2 child, children 3 or 4 or more. And the light blue line refers to 7+. That's on the right-hand side axis. So, so you can see here that the 3-child norm is very common here, which is very different than in other societies. And even among seculars, you'll see that. Yeah. Okay, sure.
Direction.
Oh, sure. Okay. Okay. So let me just show you a little bit about Arab women. We have a real decline here in 7+, the blue line. Proportion of women who have 7 or more children is going way, way down. 4+ is still very high. Okay. It hasn't changed that much among I'll just skip to, oh, this is actually something that's really interesting and something that people are not really aware of. In addition to the fact that the declines in 7+ and 4+, there's also a lot of childlessness among Muslims, much higher than among Jews. In other words, women who never have children, it's associated with non-marriage and has to do with imbalance in the marriage market between women and men. So that's actually more common among Muslims than among Jews.
Can we ask why is there an imbalance? Is it because of polygamy?
No, that's minor, very minor. Well, part of it has to do with historical fertility decline, because what happens is that generally speaking, women tend to marry men who are a bit older than they are. So when you have changes in fertility over time, it affects the relative sizes of cohorts. And when you have population growth, as the Muslim population had in the past, because there was such enormous population growth in the 50s and 60s and 70s, so with that population growth, you have every year more and more children born, and if you're looking to older cohorts to find a spouse, there's an imbalance between the number of men and women. One of my doctoral students was looking into that and trying to get a measure of imbalance in the marriage market. So that's something that's not uncommon. So you actually have high proportions of Muslim women who never marry and don't have children. Where did we get that? Higher, around here it's around 12%. Oh, this is Arab women. It's around 12%. In Jews, we'll see that it's lower. Okay, so oh, I just wanted to show, okay, this is for Jewish women, and you see the 3-child norm here, and it's even true for secular native-born Jews. You also have here the 3-child norm, okay, which is very outlying, is a great outlier compared to. So people say, well, of course, in Israel, fertility is high. There's so many ultra-Orthodox women. There's Bedouins. There's all these, outlying, small groups with very high fertility. But that's true. Obviously, that makes a difference. But also, even within what you'd consider to be the low fertility group, it's still outlier. It's still an outlier. And so I want to talk a little bit about that later too.
What about the Christian, the Arab Christian?
Very low fertility.
And the secular Jews.
Yes, it's low. I think it's lower than Jews. Yeah, something like that. Yeah, and Druze also very low. Yeah.
When you conduct your research,
yeah,
you base it on a woman, whether she's married or not. I mean, or maybe the portion of single parents, single mothers who never married, is so small that it's insignificant.
Well, in some populations, it's basically insignificant.
I'm talking about Israel.
Yeah, I mean, within, let's say, Muslim population or ultra-Orthodox Jewish population, non-marital fertility is extremely low. Mm. Overall, in the Jewish population, I think it's right now about 5% of births annually are to women who are not married at the time of the birth, if you want to define it in that sense. So it's increasing. Non-marital fertility is increasing in the Jewish population, but it's still very low compared to, if you look at Sweden, you have about 40% or 50% of births are to women who are not married at the time of the birth. Yeah, so we're way outlier on that.
And the 10% of no children, is it the high?
Which 10%? Oh, for seculars? Well, it's high compared to Israel. It's not high compared to European, no, it's not high compared to most European countries. It's on the lower side. It's not extremely low, but it's definitely on the lower side.
And compared to the United States?
It's on the lower side, yeah. Most countries would be more like 15 to 20%. 10 is at the lower limit of that. Okay. Okay, what is common among all Jewish groups is the relatively low levels of childlessness and also relatively low levels of one-child families. That's not very common. So 3 is very common, 0 and 1 are relatively uncommon, and that's really what's driving the difference between Israel and everywhere else. Secular Jews have seen statistically significant increases in childlessness, but only there. Okay, and we have the ultra-Orthodox with very high proportions of very large families. Okay, let me skip over here. Oh, this is starting about, let me skip because we don't have so much time. Anyone wants to? Oh, okay, so let me just start to focus on some of the more analytical questions. As I said, there are some subpopulations with very high fertility, such as the ultra-Orthodox, and also religious Jews. I mean, I'm basing this on social survey data where people self-define. People say what they consider themselves to be, and you can self-define as religious. And they also have, as we saw before, 3.5, 4 children per woman, which is extraordinarily high by European standards. So obviously that raises the aggregate level of fertility, and we want to understand a little bit what's driving their high fertility. I'll get into that in a little bit. And then the flip side of the coin is that even among secular Jews, fertility is still high. So it's not only the religiosity factor, it's high even among secular. And why is it so high? And then Itamar asked me to say if I think it will stay high or not. So I'll speculate a little bit about that. Okay, so well, I'm a demographer and a sociologist and an economist, so I kind of come out of that literature, and I really I'm not so familiar with the literature that you guys are working with, but one of the interesting writers who talk about the effects of religion and religiosity on fertility are Calvin Goldscheider and Kevin McQuillan, and I take my starting point from some of their theories. And what they say basically is that religion or religiosity will have an effect on fertility if they have if religion has institutional power, if religion has the power through community and through institutions to influence people through sanctions, through social pressure, through community pressure. Yeah?
Does that mean just Jewish religion or any religion?
No, the general, more in...
Every religion has an issue with fertility? Same as Judaism?
No. For example, one of the things that Kevin McQuillan was writing about was that he, I was just telling Rachel about this, is that he looks at the Catholics in Quebec. And if you go back several decades, you find that the Catholics in Quebec and Canada had extraordinarily high fertility of about like 9 or 10 kids on average. And it was related to the strength, the institutional strength of the Catholic Church in Quebec. And then what happened was when they lost their power, fertility in Quebec absolutely fell. And now in Quebec, fertility among Catholics in Quebec is lower, is about less than 2. It's the lowest in Canada. So it's not religion per se, it's the same religion, Catholicism, but the influence that it has over fertility is vastly different depending on the institutional context. You can look, there's a lot of other really fascinating historical examples of that, like if you look at the Mormons in Utah, who had historically, that's very well documented because the Mormons keep very careful records It's part of their religious duties. So we have a lot of historical knowledge that Mormons had like 8 or 9 kids before the turn of the 19th century because of the institutional power of the Mormon church. They were the ones who distributed the land. They were the ones that gave people livelihood. And people's social status in the community was determined in part by how many children they had. That showed that they were conforming to what the church expected from them, and they were rewarded if they were conforming to those expectations. So it's based on the idea that the community and the social pressure works from the religion to convey the pro-natalist messages, but those messages won't be conveyed and won't be carried through unless there's institutional power of religion to actually affect people's lives in a direct way. So that's why Israel is a very interesting example, because it's one of the only cases where there's no separation between religion and state, and a lot of the state's activity is intertwined with religion. Yeah.
Could you just say again what years you're talking about in terms of the Mormons?
The Mormons, that would be in the 19th century. Fertility decline in the 19th.
How can that be disconnected from something like during that period?
Yeah.
From, let's say, the need for manpower for work. I mean, was it qualitative, the research that was done, that people were asked why they're having? I mean, how do you make that causal connection between the strength of the institutions and churches?
Well, yeah, that wasn't qualitative. That was when they went back to historical data collected by the Mormons themselves. When you have church records, a lot of times you write down, the child was born.
How was the link made to the?
Well, it's interpretive. It's interpretive. But what happened was basically. The idea was that during the 19th century, the Latter-day Saints, they were incorporated into the United States, and they couldn't just do whatever they wanted. The United States told them, look guys, you're part of the United States, you have to live according to our laws. You can't just make your own laws and parcel out resources whichever way you like. So the power of the church was taken away by the state. Gradually. So you're right, it's an interpretation of what there was.
And
but
you look at the statistics and make some kind of assumptions about the two graphs going in the same way.
Absolutely, you're right. It's an interpretation. It's an interpretation. But the Mormons are an extreme case because their fertility was so incredibly high. It was higher than other rural frontier populations. Fertility was high in the frontier of the United States during the 19th century, but there it was extremely high, and the fertility decline was pronounced. So it's a special case. But you're right, it's interpretive.
As far as I know, the Mormons, when I was young in the 60s, 70s, they were also having a lot of children.
Yeah, but it's not like that. Yes, right. Still today, Mormon fertility is higher, but we're talking, maybe 3 or 2.5 children on average, as opposed to 2. Okay. Not 8 or 10. Yeah, no, it's not like it used to be. Yes, it's still high, but not like it used to be. Yeah.
Within the Mormon community, though, is there still higher fertility, say, in Salt Lake City and in sort of the core center of the church, as opposed to, as the Mormons have spread out and have established communities throughout America? Is there still, because Salt Lake City is a unique place to go to with the Mormon church and the presence of it there. Is there any sense that maybe the institution still has a bit more sway in Salt Lake City?
Oh, that's a good question. I really don't know. That would be a good research question to see what the institutional power, how it differs in different areas as you get further away from the center. Yeah. Yeah.
Religious Jews, ultra-Orthodox in the United States having the same fertility rate as maybe not 7, but higher than the...
Higher than average, but not anywhere near these levels. No. And Jewish fertility overall in the U.S. is low.
No, but the ultra-Orthodox.
Yeah. Well, it's higher than seculars, but it wouldn't be anywhere near these levels. No. No. So it's something that's particular to the Israeli context. It's not Right, that's why there's no absolutes in religion. I was just talking with Rachel about it before, that I like to give examples. People tend to have a sort of an intuitive, a naive understanding of the relationship between religion and fertility, which doesn't exist, because I like to give the example of Iran. If you look at Iran after the Islamic Revolution in the early 1980s, fertility was extremely high. It was around 8 children per woman until around the mid-1980s. And then what happened was the Islamic revolutionary government looked at their census and saw that their age pyramid looked like this, and they had so many kids they wouldn't be able to provide for basic education and health, and so they introduced a population policy that's, you know, they got the religious leaders involved, intimately involved in coming out and saying, you know, to have 2 kids, birth control is okay at the local level, and bringing that down, that message down at the village level with the support of the religious leaders. And then Iran had an amazing fertility decline. I mean, within 15 years, their fertility dropped from a total fertility rate of about 7.5 to maybe 2.5. That's like, there's almost nothing like that in history to see a transition like that in such a short amount of time. There's been a lot of transitions, but they're usually not that quick. So that's in an Islamic country. And you see that all over the Islamic world, that fertility has gone down. So it's not as obvious as one might think. Yeah.
I'm going to suggest that we maybe let her run through some more slides and then save this questions for that. Unless you
Oh, sure. What? Fine. You pull the shot. Okay. So what I tried to look at, so Goldscheider and McQuillan are saying that, you know, it doesn't really matter. They don't take a literal understanding of laws. You know, you're not allowed to use birth control, you're not allowed to have an abortion, you're not allowed to have sex without marriage. They don't necessarily say that those specific prescriptions make a difference, but they're talking more about how religion, the power of religion is, the influence is through the institutions to convey pronatalist messages, and it could be through gender norms, and it could be through community pressures. So that's what I tried to take a look at. Another important aspect that McQuillan talks about is the blending of religion and nationalism. He says in his theory that the importance of religion in terms of affecting fertility is especially pronounced when the religion is closely tied to nationalism, with a national ethnic identity, which is really the case here in Israel. So I tried to get a little bit about that. Now, there are economic theories. There are different economic theories that are really more focused on things like women's labor force participation. The idea that, well, religious women aren't going to get a high education. They're not going to be working in the labor market, so the opportunity cost of them having, you know, large families is low, since they're not working anyway, and that's why they have high fertility. So I tried to check that too, and actually didn't find any support for that, because women who work do tend to have fewer children, but that doesn't have to do with their religiosity. That doesn't explain the connection between religiosity and fertility. So why I thought this was interesting, I mentioned it briefly, is because it's a fascinating case where really religion is part of the state, so that the potential for the McQuillan framework to come out is really very unusual. And it's also, Israel is also another interesting case, it's kind of a paradox, because Israel has very high women's labor market participation. Israeli women work, they're highly educated, and they have high fertility. So that's another sort of interesting question of how is that accomplished. Okay, and we talked about religiosity and nationalism being blended together. So So what I found was in my research, you probably can't read these numbers. Okay, well, we had a whole bunch of questions on the social survey that asked people, is it for, one of the questions is, for example, how important is it for you to live in a community with people who are as religious as you are? The idea is it important for you to live in a neighborhood where the other people in their neighborhood are like you? Okay, and people answered to what extent that that's important for them. And one of the things that we found was that when people said yes, it's important for them to live in a neighborhood where the people are like they are in terms of their religion, that even among religious people, that made the effect of the religiosity greater. In other words, people can say, yeah, I'm religious, but I don't care where I live. I can live anywhere. So the effect of them being religious on their fertility was dampened compared to people who are saying, yes, I'm religious and it's important to me to live with others who are like me. And we took that as sort of an indicator of the importance of the community, the sort of segregated communities, and how that kind of magnifies the impact of religiosity on fertility. Also, we had measures of do you affiliate yourself with a certain stream within Judaism, and we found that those who affiliated, they didn't just say, yes, I'm religious, but they specifically affiliated with a certain stream within Judaism that also magnified the effect of the religiosity on fertility. So again, we interpreted that in terms of being more tied into a community, being more tied into others who are socially like you and expect the same behaviors as you are. We also actually looked at we tried to get at sort of issues of the relationship between nationalism, the separation between state and religion, by asking, are you in favor of the option of civil marriage? In other words, how much of the religion, because that's a very strong issue in terms of how religion is institutionalized in the state through marriage, through divorce, through burial. That's one of the major institutional factors of religion in Israel, which is unlike most other places, and how that's tied into the effect of religiosity on fertility. So we found a lot of evidence that the role of religion is through these greater issues, not only specifically what you might think is written in the religions. So we did find support for the McQuillan and Goldscheider framework. One thing that was interesting, and this surprised me, was we didn't find any connection through gender norms. We thought that we would find, and I'm curious if you guys have an idea about it, we thought that we would find that more religious have more traditional gender norms, meaning that women should be the primary caretakers of their children, and the role of women is to have children, which is a very, very important norm in Israel. Women are seen as the reproducers of the nation. That's one of the, not that women don't need to work, women need to work also, but their number one purpose is to produce children for the nation. And we didn't see that in any way was associated with religion, or with religiosity. In other words, we didn't see that the effects of religiosity were mediated through gender norms. So that I thought was interesting. Yeah?
You have a sample of all the national religious people in Israel, I mean, in all different places and communities?
We, as I said, we were looking at the social survey. It's supposed to be a nationally representative survey of adults age 20 and over. I say supposed to be because I won't sign my life on it, but they do make efforts to, these are surveys that are done face-to-face. They're not telephone surveys. They're face-to-face, and they're surveys that are done in a way so as to make the surveys comparable to other representative surveys like the labor force survey. Okay, so it'll be comparable in terms of geographic dispersion, in terms of age distribution, in terms of sex. The social survey is the one and only source that will of data from the government that tells you information about religiosity. There is no other data source on that. So that's why we went on that. But it's considered to be a pretty reliable data source.
Do you think there could be a respondent bias? In other words, because people already sense that it's politically incorrect to say something they might be considered chauvinist, they don't express it, but in fact that may not be reflected. In other words, might there be some reporting bias there?
In terms of
gender? Why wasn't it reflected? Because intuitively, if it's a stereotype, I would think it would come through.
Yeah, that people don't say that it would be. It could be that people feel that they're expected to have more politically correct gender norms, and therefore that's a possibility. That would make the relationship weaker because we wouldn't see it. I mean, but the kinds of questions they ask on the social surveys are things that are asked in social surveys all across the world. I mean, they didn't just invent these questions. They there's questions like, women and men should both contribute to the income of a household. How strongly do you agree to that? Or, women who work full time, their children suffer. How much do you agree with that? These are statements that actually a lot of people do agree with those things, and they're kind of things that are asked across the world. But
aren't a lot of these surveys are performed in like Western countries where the gender where you're most expected to be politically correct? Like, so if you do these surveys in like Muslim countries, you'll have more straightforward answers about these gender norms, no? Like, is it a good assumption?
Well, but if the surveys are anonymous, then...
But no, they're going face-to-face.
Face-to-face, they are face-to-face, yeah. But I'm sorry, I didn't exactly understand your question.
So you were talking about the politically correctness of I guess guys who answer that women shouldn't be at home, and the gender norm, they think something, they think one thing and they answer a politically correct answer.
Yeah, okay.
And I would assume, but I can't. I'm just assuming that in Western countries, more men would say politically correct answers, even though they think something else. And in comparing to Eastern countries, where it's very common to think and say that. So
that could be. That's a good question. I don't know what the bias is on that. Yeah, well, you always have that problem with attitudinal questions, that you think the person's answering something that the interviewer wants to hear. Yeah.
Seems that the easiest way to affect fertility would be economic. The question is, did you research this? Will reduced support or no support to children will affect the fertility?
I didn't do that myself. A colleague of mine at Hebrew University, Jonas Chalkins, I told Rachel about him. He wrote an article recently looking at how people respond to changes over time in child benefits. In other words, the monthly benefits that are paid to women depending on the number of children that they have, and he did see some response. And actually, there's been a dip. I think I showed you in one of the earlier slides somewhere. What was it at the beginning somewhere? Here. No. Here. That here. These are the ultra-Orthodox women, and some people claim that this decline here was due to what happened was in the early 2000s, the child benefit policy was changed, because it used to be a policy where each additional child gave a bigger bump to the total child benefit. So the extra for the fourth child was more than the extra for the second child, and the extra for the sixth child was bigger than the extra for the fourth child. It was an increasing scale. And then in around 2002, that was cut to a flat. Each additional child was the same amount. And that really affected the income level of families with large numbers of children. I mean, it was done in a gradual way, so it wasn't like, you know, in one time. But some people do believe that this change here was due to that. But, you know, when you look at it from the other side, let's put it on the other side of the picture, countries like in Europe that want to raise fertility, okay, they have the opposite problem of here. Here fertility is probably too high. Their fertility is probably too low in almost all of Europe. And they're breaking their heads trying to figure out what to do to raise fertility because they're suffering from population aging and from, you know, a negative population growth, and then they have to bring in immigrants to fill up the labor force, and then they have lots of other issues that stem from immigrant integration and assimilation and changing cultural values and so on. So they're trying to raise fertility, and they can't really do it with family benefits. It's too expensive. You know, most research has shown that the effects are so small. The amount of money that you'd have to pay people to have another child are just so enormous, it would be impossible, budget-wise, to actually make a real dent on that. So the effects are real, but they're small. That's not the main thing that's driving, in my opinion. The effects are real, but they're not explaining the whole thing.
Done,
yeah.
Taking another economic factor.
Yeah.
The assumption, the state assumed more responsibility in terms of state institutions to support old age people. In old times, it was the number of children who could support the grandparents and parents as they aged and stopped working.
Right.
Now, as the state assumed some of those responsibilities in terms of old age homes and whatever other benefits, I mean, instead of supporting the number of children, supporting going down in terms of state support to those institutions would increase the number of children, because otherwise they would have nobody to take care of them when they get old.
You're arguing that as the government takes over some of the functions of family in terms of caretaking for the old, so that would be a reason for fertility to decline.
Yes.
Yeah, well, absolutely. I mean, that's one of the major. I mean, now you're talking about, you know, when we look at. Okay, let me take a step back. I mean, basically, we have undergone global fertility decline over the last 250 years. If you go back to the early 1800s, everywhere in the world, fertility was high. 5, 6, or more children, including in Europe. Okay, and then what happened is towards the end of the 19th century, we started a fertility transition in most parts of Europe. So people started having, instead of 5 or 6 children, 2 or 3 children. And some of the reasons are what you're talking about, is that some of the role of family changed, and that children were seen more as an economic cost rather than as an economic benefit. The labor market, the structure of the economy completely changed. Things became more industrial and less rural. So, I mean, those factors are definitely taken into consideration in terms of understanding global fertility decline. Okay, well, I'm asking sort of another question. I'm saying, like, well, given that we have all of those institutions in Israel, given that this is a rich country, given that this is a very educated population, given that it's a democracy, okay, how do we explain that the fertility is so high? Okay, there's a huge literature that explains why fertility fell. Now, I'm trying to sort of say, given that literature, given everything we know about what happened over the last 250 years, and comparing ourselves now to Europe, which is at a much lower level of fertility, how do we understand why the fertility here is so high, despite the fact that we have a lot of public services and so on. Yeah.
No, it's.
I just want to, before you go, I'm about to throw it open to questions. Are there a few more slides you wanted to show us?
Yeah, I just wanted to.
We have 15 minutes total.
It's 20 minutes, so I want to give her time to 15 minutes.
Okay, I'll just give one more slide and then I'll be happy to. I just wanted to go a little bit more into some of what I think, back to the beginning. But some of what I think regarding some of the reasons, I don't know what happened? Some of the reasons why I think seculars are I may have lost you, but okay. Why even among, I want to get to the second question. Why is fertility so high even among seculars? Setting aside the religion, and I think it's a constellation of factors which is unusual in Israel. If you can't point to one factor, I think it's a combination of interrelated factors, and I try to talk about them here. There's a state and family support for childbearing. There is a dual emphasis on the social political importance of women's employment as well as fertility. There are policies that support working mothers, even within a conservative welfare regime that is essentially patriarchal and expects the family to be the one who's caring for welfare.
But welfare here is not, women's welfare is not as good as in places in Europe where fertility rate is much lower, so you have much better maternity leave.
You're right, absolutely, I agree with you. That's why I say I don't think it's one factor. Okay, it's a factor, but it's not the only factor, and it's probably not the most important factor. I agree with you on that. There's plenty of places where the conditions are much better than over here. I think this is something that I'm working on recently now, is that Israel is a very familial society in the sense that they're strong families. That means that people rely on their families to be taken care of. It's not a social democratic regime like in Sweden or Scandinavian countries where the government takes care of you. Here, the family takes care of you, and therefore the influence of family on fertility is very strong, and that can come through various ways. For example, grandparental assistance is very common in Israel. Grandparents provide financial assistance for their adult children, which subsidizes having grandchildren. They give free babysitting to their adult children. We have comparative data in that, and it's very, very high in Israel. Okay, so the preferences of the grandparents to have more grandchildren, it's not only a preference, it's actually always also carried through aid. Actually in Israel there's relatively gender egalitarian values, and men and women, relatively speaking, share household work, and there's a lot of outsourcing. A lot of people pay a third party to babysit, to clean their house, and much more than in other societies. So that also helps to keep women working and having more children, because they're somewhat relieved of what they need to do at home. Marriage is a very important social institution. Marriage is a prop for fertility, because when people are in stable married couples, they tend to have more children. One of the reasons people abroad do not attain their fertility ideals is because they're not in stable partnerships. Okay, there's serial partnerships, people break up, and people don't have as many children as they'd like. I think it's a very, very strong value, collectivist behavior. The symbols of nationalism are embedded everywhere, in school, in national holidays, in every government system. And that's even secular people are affected by that. Even people who say they are not religious, when you ask them, well, is it important for you to have a Jewish burial? Is it important for you to have a Jewish marriage? They say yes, even if they're not religious, so it goes through. And as I mentioned before, women as the biological reproducers of the nation is a strong value.
There's one thing is, to me, seems missing.
Yeah.
I mean, there is an impact. Even you're talking about secular Jews. The impact of their parents and grandparents, which used to have large families. So I mean, this change is very gradual. I'm talking about myself, for example. Both my mother and my father, they had 6 children in the family.
Right. But that's not uncommon because in all of Europe underwent a fertility decline. You can look back in Italy too, 2 or 3 generations ago, and it was the same. It's not only the fertility transition among Jews. Jews were one of the early groups to have a fertility transition, but that's a global phenomenon. So I agree with you, there is research that shows that people are influenced by the number of brothers and sisters that they had, and maybe that's operating through the help that adults give their, grandparents give their adult children, but I don't think that's unique to this setting. Yeah.
I'd like to suggest another factor, and this is security. I mean, people in Israel feel that maybe 2 children is not enough. If worse comes to worse, we're going to be left with only 1 child. So.
Right. No national conflict. It's written. It's written in the role of the Jewish nationalism and ethno.
Well, that's not exactly what I mean.
Nationalism at all.
That's not exactly
The
what I
insurance
mean.
policy is for sure.
Something very.
Well, I thought also that might be the case. So one of the tests I did of that, and it didn't show me support for that argument, is I looked at couples who had at least 2 children, okay? And I said, that had at least 2 children, and I said, okay, let's see if they had either 2 boys or 2 girls or 1 girl and 1 boy. Thinking that if what you're saying is true, then it would be more of an impact on couples who have 2 boys because the risks are higher. So I expected to see that among couples who have at least 2 children where both of them are boys, they'll be more likely to go to the 3rd child. And it wasn't the case, it was equal across.
You may be right, but it's contrary in Israel to say, especially for men, that they like more girls than boys. I mean, and 2.
Why they like more girls than boys?
I don't know, but it's one tone. But you said that the girls take care of their parents better, etc.
Okay, so there may be other factors.
There is a better relations between father and daughter. And 2, I think, I'm not sure, that people won't speak out loudly about, or don't even confess in such a talk about saying that they are afraid that some of their child might be happen something to him because it's bad luck. Just to say it or to think about it.
But why do you say, Alon, that you think it's certainly an issue? I mean, why?
Intuitively, the insurance policy, you hear it all the time. I mean, just the conversations. I think was spot on, but it's intuitive. It may be.
I tried to find it.
Maybe the questions were not formulated to point what Alon is saying.
Well, there wasn't a question.
No, she said exactly what
she checked over
just checked to see if it,
I think there's a huge assumption there, though, that the loss of a child would be through going into the army, which is not necessarily true. There was a period here when there was, a lot of terrorism, people were being blown up on buses, but wait, I actually wanted to say something else, and that was, I don't know where this idea of kind of like the Tofa'at Eder, I'm not quite sure how that would be, everyone does, is it the collective behavior, everyone does what everyone else does kind of thing, that's the collective behavior?
Okay, let me explain a little.
Where does that fall in? Because I think that like now people are having 4 children, young couples, and it's because all their friends are having 4 children.
Okay, that's not exactly, that's also an effect, I think, it's a different effect, but that's not exactly what I was referring to. What I was referring to was the idea that in postmodern societies, there is more of an emphasis on individualistic values. autonomy, the ability to reach your own goals, to attain your own goals, free of institutional demands or requirements. Okay, so that's a kind of post-material along with lower fertility. We see that all over Europe. One of the theories of why fertility is so low in Europe is because there's more of an emphasis on individualism, and you do, what's good for you to reach your own goals. And that's what you expect your partner to do, to help you reach your goals. The goal of a partnership is not to produce more children necessarily, but to have a couple which help each other to attain their own goals and be autonomous. So those values of the individual as opposed to the collective are usually found in other countries to be in conflict with high levels of fertility. They are the values of tolerance, of non-traditional family forms, all of the rejection of authority, okay, and the social pressure usually goes along with lower fertility and postponement of parenthood.
So that's not the situation in Israel, is what you're saying?
It's much less so in Israel than in other countries. Yes, the collectivist notion, as Sami Samucha writes about it, is a very, very powerful value here, much more than in other countries.
We have time for 2 questions. Is somebody who hasn't had a chance to ask a question? Misha and anybody else?
Talking about secular Israelis. Mm-hmm. It's anecdotal, but I've heard it many times. Mm-hmm. If I'm feeding so many parasites, I am entitled to have many children.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
It's very politically incorrect, but people say it.
There's also an opposite of that. If there are so many parasites reproducing, I don't want any kids.
But there is a saying that even before you have kids, you provide for other person, another kid. So,
and the continuation of the same, maybe subconscious, is the tragedy of the commons. Mm-hmm. The others are doing it. Why shouldn't I?
Yeah. Oh, I just wanted to get back just to what Itamar asked me regarding secular fertility. What do I think of for the future? Well, I actually think that in the future fertility will go down among seculars, at least among seculars, because I think that there is changing values. I think that collectivist, post-Zionist values are taking hold, especially among secular, more educated population groups. I think because of these economic difficulties, the opposite to what you're saying, sir, is that young people feel that their economic situation is poor. Even the educated, they feel that they can't do as well as their parents did 20 or 30 years ago. Not that unemployment is very high, but the cost of living is very high. And they may have high fertility ideals, but they may not be able to attain those ideals due to changing values and also changing economic conditions. And I think so we will see. I think my prediction is that in the cohorts that are in the next 5 to 10 years completing their fertility, I think we will see a continued decline in fertility among seculars at least.
And among other groups?
Among other groups, I also expect to see a continued decline of fertility among Muslims. We've seen that it's going along with enormous expansion of educational opportunities for Muslim women, which have actually overtaken increase in education among Muslim men, and also more recently increasing labor force participation of Muslim women, and also increasing labor force participation among ultra-Orthodox women. So I also believe that the very high rates of population growth or high fertility levels will moderate. I believe so.
We have time for our last question if anybody wants to wrap up.
Is there an impact here of the biological cause that fertility goes down? I mean, people, it's more difficult to to make children today, okay?
I'm not really sure that that argument really has teeth. I mean, it's a problem because what happens is there's a worldwide trend towards the delay of parenthood. That's true. That's part of the change that's associated with greater individualistic values and self-attainment and autonomy. Is people are postponing parenthood. That you see all over the world. And what happens is, since people are postponing longer, they're more likely to get to the point where they may be having trouble to get pregnant. But it's not that overall everybody's becoming less fecund. I don't think that's a major effect. It's just that because of the postponement, those effects are magnified when people are waiting longer.
Are they postponing them for baby roll too?
Alone.
Sorry?
What about the methodology?
Less.
I want to ask.
Sorry?
I mean, the kind of data you're dealing with calls for at least on the basic level multiple regression. So I'm sure somebody ran.
Oh yeah, I didn't present that here because I didn't want to get too technical. But yeah, I tried to take as many factors of those that I discussed here in my last slide. I tried to take them into consideration in a multiple regression framework.
The most recent article she has is one of the most complicated multiple regressions I've ever seen.
Yeah.
So if you're looking for it, she knows what the statistics are solid. I'm told by Itamar that the Alphabet is going to come out with a shotgun in about a minute. But I wanted to say on behalf of the forum how much we appreciate you coming out and sharing. And everybody else, first of all,